A note to listeners, the following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences.
I won't go into the details, but I will suffice it to say that my sister's murder was actually ruled by the California Supreme Court as one of the highest disregards for human suffering. And as hard as that night and unimaginable was on my family, what really took a toll on us was being thrust into the criminal justice system.
Well, I've always said this, when you're dealing with sexual offenders, it's a different type of criminal. They're very dangerous. They're very hard to rehabilitate, and they need to be treated as a different type of criminal, especially, a violent serial sexual criminal. It's a whole other level. I mean, these guys cannot be rehabilitated. They will do it again. And it is a risk to even drop them down to a level 2. Serial killers just can't be rehabilitated in the way another criminal can be.
California has voted in the death penalty twice, and then in 2016 voted to streamline the process. Then comes Governor Newsom, who in his campaign promised the voters of California that although he may not believe in the death penalty, he would uphold what the voters wanted. And then within 48 hours of becoming governor of our great state, he put a moratorium on the death penalty. And I was there when he did it with our class, and it was just so inhumane for what he did to Mark.
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman. Hi, everyone. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, even if it's one word.
And please subscribe to our website, www.partnersintruecrime. Follow us on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram to check out our weekly promos. We're also now on YouTube at Partners in True Crime. If you subscribe to our website, you'll be getting weekly emails from us and all kinds of promotions and things that we don't advertise on the podcast.
Hey, Cindy, do you know this week, this is the 100th episode of Partners in True Crime?
Yay! I can't believe it.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's gone so fast.
It's crazy is right. We want to thank all our listeners for your continued support. Creating this podcast has been a very rewarding journey for us. Right, Cindy?
Yeah, it's been amazing. I mean, we've done so much, and it's just Rob and I. So we're just cranking them out.
Cranking them out. And you turned our house into a crime story headquarters, but we love it. And we have some exciting news coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned.
Oh my gosh, you're not going to believe what's coming up. I'm so excited. I don't want to spoil the surprise. But you have to listen to, if you already haven't, season 4 of Partners in True Crime, My Uncle's Escape to Alcatraz. It is such an exciting story for us because we've always been really intrigued by the Escape from Alcatraz story. And we're thrilled to have Ken and Mike as co-hosts. They're awesome. They have a book coming out in May, and we're going to be releasing never before seen photos and a trailer on YouTube. So if you haven't already done so, please check out our YouTube channel. We really need more subscribers on there, and we want to grow that channel. So we need your support. Thank you so much.
Okay, for now, today's podcast, Serial Killer Whisper. San Quentin's death row has been in the process of being dismantled for the past several months. And besides an article in the LA Times, there hasn't been any media attention on this issue.
And besides Laura posting on social media and us posting, we've been looking and there really isn't anything. So we wanted to discuss what the possible repercussions are going to be from the closure of San Quentin. And how is this going to affect the victims of serial offenders and potential victims that have not been found? And the prison correction officers are going to be dealing with these serial offenders who are going to be put into general population.
Which is why we invited Nina Salerno on the podcast.
Okay, so this is the backstory with Nina. First of all, I went to college with Nina. And her story was tragic. I was 17 years old when she told me this story. In 1979, on the first day of her freshman year at college, Nina's older sister, 18-year-old Katina Salerno, was murdered, execution style, by her ex-boyfriend.
A year later, Nina, who was only 13 years old, testified before Ronald Reagan's task force on criminal justice to put her sister's murderer in prison.
I went to college with Nina, and when she told us this story, we were just shocked, and we couldn't believe what had happened to her. But we also knew that she was determined to protect victims and change lives from a very early age. Nina had an amazing role model. Her mother, Harriet Salerno, used the grief of losing her daughter to fuel her passion for justice, and she founded the esteemed organization Crime Victims United.
For For the past 20 years, Nina was the president of Crime Victims United, fighting for the rights of victims, changing laws, and the co-author of the Amber Alert in California.
I'm so proud to say that in 2023, Nina was appointed as the District Attorney of Modoc County, California.
We're really happy to have her on the podcast today with Laura Brand to discuss this crazy issue that's going on in the prison system in California. Okay, so we have Laura, and then we also have a special guest, Nina Salerno. Nina used to be the head of Crime Victims United. Now she's a board member and she's an attorney. And both Laura and Nina both have a unique experience, similar experience. They both had people very close to them that were murdered. Nina had her sister when she was a very young age murdered by her boyfriend. And if you remember, Laura had her best friend murdered by her cousin. And these two just met like a couple weeks ago, introduced by Rob Dick, the private detective, who's also a board member on Crime Victims United. So we wanted to have Nina on today because San Quentin has dissolved death row, and Nina has a very unique experience with prisons in the state of California. She used to work for the Attorney General's office, and she also used to represent all the correctional officers in the state of California. So Nina, thanks for being on with us today. And tell us a little bit about yourself for the audience. We know a lot about you. You used to go to college with my wife, Cindy. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very, very small world that we're all connected. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Nina.
I did go to college with your wife, which was just fun. But I was born and raised in San Francisco. Had wonderful parents, and they raised us, my two sisters and I. And on September 3rd, 1979, my sister was murdered execution style at the University of Pacific on her first day of college. I won't go into the details, but I will suffice it to say that my sister's murder was actually ruled by the California Supreme Court as one of the highest disregards for human suffering. And as hard as that night and unimaginable was on my family, what really took a toll on us was being thrust into the criminal justice system. I mean, we grew up in a family that was very active in the community, active in politics, always supported for public safety. So you enter into the criminal justice system believing that what is right will take place, that the victims will be heard and justice will be served. And we found the exact opposite in this case, and began to learn that that was true for victims, especially at that time. We had no rights, no voice, no anything in the system. I come from an incredible mother who probably took the worst tragedy to befall a parent. And I remember the day she closed my sister's casket, just telling my father she wasn't sure why God chose our family, but she knew that it was not going to be for nothing. And she began fighting for the rights of victims in California. And I can remember watching her at 12 years old go up and down to the Capitol, only to come back and say that people, shut doors on her, wouldn't listen to her, walked out in Senate hearings. But she'd go back the next day and fight and fight. And then she finally caught the eye of a very important person, and that was President Ronald Reagan. And at 13 years old, I was by my mom's side as we traveled throughout the United States, testifying in front of his task force about the treatment of crime victims, which resulted in the crime victims movement beginning. And I do credit my mom with that. And she continued to fight and then formed Crime Victims United with two other very incredible women. One was Doris Tate, the mother of Sharon Tate, and the other one was Marcella Leach, it was the mother of Marcy, which later there was a constitutional amendment for the rights of victims called Marcy's Law that was passed that my mom and I were instrumental in. So I grew up doing that, being an advocate. I've spent most of my career as a prosecutor or advocating for victims. The reason why I don't serve as president of Crime Victims United currently is because I'm now the elected district attorney for Modoc County in California. So I've continued throughout my entire career and in my position now advocating strongly for public safety in California.
Amazing. And didn't you speak before a governing body when you were very young?
Yes, that's when I testified in front of President Reagan's task force at 13.
Amazing.
I had been a witness to significant events leading up to my sister's murder and ended up testifying for about a day and a half, where the only person I knew in the courtroom was the murderer of my sister, who had stalked and executed her. So, and that it took its toll for a very long time. So it was great to see really good things start to happen, especially in California, which I think led the nation. If you remember, in the 1980s and then through the 1990s, California actually was one of the safest states in the United States because we had things like the 3 strikes and you're outlawed, and the 1 strike law for sex offenders, and Megan's Law, and law enforcement had the tools to do their job. And unfortunately now we've seen an entire backlash of that in California, and we are now, I believe, either not number 1, number 2. New York is number 1 in violent crime in the state of California. Downgraded very violent crimes such as rape of an unconscious person, human trafficking of a child. Up until this year, which we fought very hard in the legislature, was no longer a serious and violent crime in California. And still, it took a fight in the legislature to bring that back up to a serious and violent crime. Domestic violence is no longer considered serious and violent in California. And there's just a whole host of these so-called criminal justice reforms, which are now allowing the worst of the worst to prey upon the families and the citizens, and the people just trying to, take their kids to school and work every day are now becoming victims of some very serious crimes.
So, Nina, well, first of all, you're always been extraordinary and an amazing human being, and the work that you do is phenomenal, honestly. Without Nina's organization, people weren't fighting for victims' rights back then. And I mean, it's incredible the amount of work that you guys have done. Right now, what's very disturbing is that San Quentin is closing and they are dissolving death row. And there isn't really much talk about it. And nobody really knows what's going on. People just assume, okay, well, death row is gone. Who knows what happens to those serial killers, serial offenders, some of the worst that Laura has been in the cage with. And we kind of wanted to get your perspective and opinion on what the repercussions of closing death row actually is going to be.
It has horrible repercussions, both from the victim perspective, but also from the public safety. I mean, Californians should be very concerned, just all the way around, even beginning with the political ramifications. Just in 2016, I have to think of the year, Californians passed Proposition 66, overwhelmingly actually, which was enacted to speed up the death penalty process in California so that people that were sentenced to death fairly and by our justice system would in fact receive the justice as mandated by our jury system. And I'm a big believer in our jury system. Obviously, I'm a prosecutor and I support it wholeheartedly. But what's also important to remember is it's the greatest system in the world. And so the California has voted in the death penalty twice, and then in 2016 voted to streamline the process. Then comes Governor Newsom, who in his campaign promised the voters of California that although he may not believe in the death penalty, he would uphold what the voters wanted. And then much within 48 hours of becoming governor of our great state, he put a moratorium on the death penalty. And I was there when he did it with Mark Glass, and it was just so inhumane for what he did to Mark. And if the listeners don't remember, Mark Glass is the father of Holly Glass, who was the young girl that sparked great change in the 1990s on behalf of victims and public safety when she was kidnapped by a predator from her home at a slumber party for her birthday, I believe, and then was brutally raped, locked in a trunk, and brutally murdered. Richard Allen Davis was sentenced to death after a trial and has been on California's death row, being afforded all his appeals and rights. And Mark Glass had to sit there when the governor told him he was going to place a moratorium on the death penalty, which meant effectively Mark would never see the justice that was handed down by a jury. And Mark is an amazing human. He's been a passionate advocate for victims' rights. And what he said to the governor was the day Polly was murdered, his heart was shattered, and what was left of it, the governor just put a knife through.
Can we just clarify a little bit what that means? So by putting a moratorium on the death penalty for Richard Allen Davis, what does that mean? Does that mean that he has the chance for parole? Does it mean that he could actually get out?
That was the first step. By putting a moratorium on the death penalty meant that nobody would ever be executed, and those people would just sit on death row while he was governor. However, then what he did very quietly, like what he's doing to San Quentin now, is he made it so that the next governor, who may actually hold up what the people of the California want, which is the death penalty, it would almost be impossible, because he's dismantled death row, and now he is systematically dismantling San Quentin, which means that was our only execution chamber in the state of California. So if in fact the next sitting governor wants to uphold the will of the people, they would have to rebuild death row to the tune, I couldn't even tell you what that would cost. I'm sure it would be unfathomable. So he pretty much has effectively usurped the voters of California, usurped juries who have handed down the death penalty for a personal belief, which he was wrong politically, and now has made it effectively that we probably will never have the death penalty again in California.
Well, the other thing that just recently happened is that these death row inmates, these killers, these serial killers and killers, can now possibly have their cases re-looked at.
Oh, yeah. So several things going on, which again, I feel sorry for the people of California, because it's basically like they've been lied to by our legislature, by our governor. So what's happening now is that we are fighting in the legislature and against others that are trying to effectively take the worst of the worst in California. So let's back up. To get to death row, any murder is horrendous. My sister was murdered. Her murderer received second-degree murder, which carries 15 years to life. Now, mind you, we would think life means you go away for life. I've had to endure 13 parole hearings to keep him in prison and watch my parents relive this tragedy. My mom's 91, and we just did a hearing when she was 89 years old, and it takes its toll on them, obviously. But so then you have life without the possibility of parole and or death. Those cases are special circumstance murders, meaning that you not only willfully murder and premeditate the murder of a human being, there are special circumstances involved. These are people that rape children or rape while they're murdering. They are torturing. They are murdering the elderly. They murder a peace officer. There's a very narrow category that gets you to that level in our penal code. You have to earn that with the most horrendous crimes and unspeakable things that are done to other human beings when they torture them as they murder them. I know a young girl that was murdered in Placer County, and they poured bleach down her throat and buried her alive. These are the kind of things that get you to life without the possibility of parole and or death. So, I mean, they are just horrendous cases. They're like the Charles Ng case, where they murdered numerous amounts of people. We don't even know how many anymore. There's still some out there. And they placed a baby in a microwave for fun. They built torture chambers. These are the people that are on California's death row. So now our legislature and Crime Victims United fought very hard against SB 94 just last year, authored by Senator Cortese, which would have allowed people that were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole after serving just 25 years of their sentence to have a chance at being resentenced, which is really just a guise for release. It's systematically a way to chip away at what a jury said they deserved and allow them a chance at freedom. And now so we fought that in the legislature and defeated it. However, they made it a 2-year bill, which means it's coming back this year. And again, we are going to fight that passionately, because these are people that are not rehabilitated. And just sitting in prison for 25 years does not make you rehabilitated, nor should they have their sentence overturned. And so that's now expanded to people like Richard Allen Davis and David Allen Rayleigh, who are on California's death row because they are some of the worst murderers. Poor Mark Glass just had to go Friday, April 4th, to Santa Clara County because there was a change of venue, and that's where the trial was heard, and listen to how Richard Allen Davis has a chance at being resentenced right now off of death row and possibly off of first-degree murder. And that's being litigated through the courts right now. The other gentleman I mentioned, David Allen Rayleigh. David Allen Rayleigh was the Carolines mansion murders, and people may not remember that. It was in 1970 where he kidnapped two teenage girls. He was the security guard at the Carolines mansion, which was an empty mansion. And he locked them down in the mansion basement. He tortured them, sexually assaulted them. He cut them with knives. He spent 24 hours driving around with them in cars, where he finally threw them in a ravine to die. And somehow they survived, only for one of the young victims to die about an hour later. There is still one surviving victim. And he is up for resentencing July 9th.
Wow. Let me just jump in here, because I want to loop Laura in here, because you said something really interesting as far as getting these inmates, these serial killers and these killers released. Laura has been spending about 10 years talking to all these serial killers on death row in San Quentin. So Laura, what could you say to the public right now about these, like the Charles Ings and the Wesley Shermantine and all these other guys that are in there that you've spoken to, about the prospect of them walking out and being free?
Well, I've always said this, when you're dealing with sexual offenders, it's a different type of criminal. They're very dangerous. They're very hard to rehabilitate, and they need to be treated as a different type of criminal, especially, a violent serial sexual criminal. It's a whole other level. I mean, these guys cannot be rehabilitated. They will do it again. And it is a risk to even drop them down to a level 2. Serial killers just can't be rehabilitated in the way another criminal can be. A sexual criminal cannot be rehabilitated like another criminal can be. What's happening in California is they keep lumping all the criminals together. And, it's being run by politics instead of, psychologists who, spend years training within prisons of, how to deal with these types of offenders and what works best with each and every single one. And right now with the politics, we're kind of lumping them all together and saying, okay, we're going to do it like Norway. And yeah, we can let them out. And you're not even catering to the motivation behind, their crimes. Everyone is different. A guy who goes into a liquor store and robs it is very different than a serial killer who, is putting a baby in a microwave and holding girls, captive in a dungeon.
Yeah.
It's just not the same.
It's not the same. And Richard Allen Davis, who swiped Polly Klaas from her bedroom at her house during a party and raped her and murdered her. This man should not be allowed out into the public. It is terrifying to think that this person could get out.
Yeah. And the irony is, and they've done this before. I mean, I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nina, Gray Davis tried to desegregate the prison population, and because they were all, as everyone knows in the prison population, they all stay with their own race. The blacks stay with the blacks, the whites stay with the whites, the Mexicans stay with the Mexicans. They all kind of subdivide themselves in that order. And in Gray Davis, he tried to desegregate them and put them, so it mixed them together. And it was a horrible experiment. There was tons of violence behind bars and stuff like that. Now what they're trying to do is they're taking these killers, these high-value target killers inside prison, and putting them in general population. And the irony is, those guys, and if he's against the death penalty, they're more than likely going to get killed on the yard. And so it's kind of working in another way. I don't understand it.
But independent of that, I mean, the chances of them getting out, Nina, is that a plausible thing?
Oh, it's very plausible. It's been done in the history of California. Robert Lee Massey was sentenced to death out of Orange County, and I believe in the early 1970s, I want to say. He murdered a mother of 2 in her driveway. Orange County put him on death row. And then there was California Supreme Court Justice Roseberg came on. She commuted his sentence to life without the possibility of parole, again, because she didn't believe in the death penalty. His sentence was then commuted to life with the possibility of parole. He was resentenced to that. He was let out. Within 6 months of being let out, he murdered a man, a father of 6 in San Francisco. He was then again put on death row. It's the only person in San Francisco ever sent to death. He was eventually executed. But history shows that this is what happens. It's kind of like the governor's thing about, okay, at first I'm going to place this moratorium, and then very quietly I'm going to dismantle San Quentin. So, okay, the moratorium came in. Prosecutors, yes, you can still seek death. I'm just not going to, on my watch, allow an execution. Okay, that was the first step. But then when you dismantle death row, we don't have a death chamber. So we can't, where's everybody? If we did, a new governor came in, how are we going to execute people? Now we're moving these people into general population, which it's just unfathomable. It's like, okay, you committed the worst and most heinous crimes, and not that any crime is really good. Let's just get something straight in California. We do not have anybody that's just sitting in prison for, marijuana or theft. We have really bad people in California's prisons. We have rapists. We have human traffickers. We have the worst of the worst in California's prisons. And so now we're going to take the really bad and just put them back in general population. And that's also kind of frightening, I think, for the correctional officers. I would not want to be a correctional officer because these guys have, they have nothing to lose. So what's going to stop? Hey, if you've been sentenced to death row, what's going to stop you from killing an officer? You're just going to get another death sentence, or maybe, life without the possibility of parole. It's just going to breed more and more violence within the prisons as well.
Yeah, no, this recently, I mean, we saw a video that just got released by the Epic Times of a correctional officer who was there for, I think, like 15 years. He basically left, he quit because it's so dangerous. And he came out and he says, the California state prison system is so dangerous right now for correctional officers that because there's so much violence happening to correctional officers because just of that. And he was a whistleblower about it. And, and it's not easy to be a whistleblower about anything, but especially something where you're fighting against a government like that. I just don't understand the rationale about how they're dealing with it. They're giving these guys no consequences. As far as the death penalty is concerned, I can understand why there was a moratorium. Listen, we've dealt with a lot of wrongful convictions cases in the past that we've highlighted in documentaries, and the system screws up a lot. And so I can understand that. But releasing them after, that's just insanity.
Or even a person who sexually assaulted a child and then murdered her should never be allowed out of prison. It shouldn't even be. Mark Klass and his family should not have to endure this. They're the victim.
No, it's
right.
These victims should have to endure this. I can attest from personal experience having to deal with parole hearings. I mean, it is horrendous because you have to relive not only do you relive the details of the crime, sometimes you probably learn more because I think, as Laura can attest, when things first happen, you kind of are numb and in a state of shock and maybe not everything's ringing true. Then you sit through a parole hearing, like I've had to do 13 of them, and I have to listen to how my sister slowly died, bleeding to death as he watched her, and just the horrendous details. And, it was hard on me, but the toll it took on my parents was amazing. Just horrendous. And then you have to have your hands are sitting in the fate of whether or not this person's going to get out is just sitting in the hands of people that don't know anything in a system that has become so unbalanced and so weighted to criminals. So poor Mark has to sit through these court hearings, relive the details of Polly's murder, which I'm sure he relives in his heart every day, just like my mom does about my sister. But having to hear it again and then having to wonder, okay, is this judge gonna resentence him? Is he gonna get out? It's just the toll it takes on the victims and the inconsideration that our criminal justice system currently has in California for victims is just, it's unspeakable.
What do you attribute this new, because they call it a progressive movement, but it seems like it's regressive. And the fact that he's using the country of Norway as a model, which only has about 6-7 million people, population total.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
And just in the state of California, you're looking at almost 50 million people. And it's like, you can't equate, it's like a false equivalency. How do you use a system it's like using a tiny house with 5 people in it and you can use those methods and laws and consequences there with an entire city. How do you do that? You can't. I don't understand the rationale.
Nobody's understanding. It's something very important. Norway is nothing like California or the United States. It's a smaller country. It does not have the level of violence that we have. And I have no idea where the governor or these progressive people and the people that he's included, I want to point this out on this redesign and remodel. There is not one crime victim that sits on that committee. Most of these people are people that believe that nobody should be incarcerated or have no background in criminal justice, haven't been out. There's not even law enforcement on this committee that is out there picking up the pieces every single day when they're having to deal with the loved ones of a murder victim or having to see what the carnage that it takes after a bomb explodes or a mass shooting takes place. And so there's nobody sitting on this committee that has anything to do with victims or public safety. And yet these are the people that we are putting in charge, the governor is putting in charge of creating this model and making it so it's more like life on the outside. Well, you got put in prison and taken away from society because you brutally murdered or tortured or raped or sold a child for slavery. You shouldn't have your life normalized like on the outside. You lost that right. And yet we're just giving it to them. It is such an unbalanced system right now, and it's under all this guise of criminal justice reform that has been taking place over the last 10 to 15 years that has really been a disservice to our California communities. If you look at when Proposition 47 was on the ballot, it was named the Safe Schools and Neighborhood Act, so people voted for it, thinking it was public safety. Well, what Proposition 47 did is it decriminalized certain things. It took human trafficking of a child, domestic violence, exploding a bomb, all these serious crimes, and made them non-violent in California. And people wonder why we're leading the nation in violent crime right now. It's because of these so-called criminal justice reforms that have just become a revolving door again in our prisons. And unfortunately, that's what was happening when Polly Klaas was murdered. And that's what you're starting to see again, is innocent people are losing their lives because we are letting out horrendous murderers and rapists and child sex predators. We are creating victims throughout our California communities and in our Black and brown communities. And I hear this all the time in the legislature that we're doing this because of the Black and brown people that are incarcerated. Well, the communities that we are hurting are our poor communities in California, because many of them don't have the means to speak out, or maybe they're afraid to because they live in a gang area. I mean, just look at Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a war zone. It's just horrible what's happening in Los Angeles. I think the murder rate in Los Angeles in the first 6 months of this year was up by 200%.
Yeah, but the crime stats are down because there's no prosecutions.
Well, we've noticed it. You know, we live outside of Los Angeles in a suburb that when I first moved here was very safe. And now, I mean, he won't even let me go to the store by myself.
Nope.
I mean, it's definitely changed, and you can feel it.
Yeah. Hey, Laura, I wanted to ask you a question. You talk to these serial killers every day inside the California system. Are they like hopeful that they may get out with all these new things that are happening?
No, not because of what's going on right now. No, most of them know they're going to die in prison. They've kind of accepted it. Some of them hold out, hope for appeals. Someone like Carpenter.
Yeah.
But the vast majority knows they're in prison for life until they die. But the transfers have been, they don't want to move off of death row. They've thought, this is where I'm going to die. Now they're being put into another prison onto mainline. The best, I think I told you yesterday, Rob, a really good analogy of what's really happening in the prisons right now is it's like going to a zoo and unlocking every cage, and all the bears, lions, tigers kind of are out and all mingling together. California is ridden with gangs. And, now they're all on the yard together. Now you have death row inmates, you have, pedophiles. Look at Richard Allen Davis. All these people are on the prison yard. It's extremely dangerous for the prison personnel and the correctional officers.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't want to be a CO at all. I can't, I mean, I got to work for CCPOA and came to great respect. CCPOA is the California Correctional Peace Officers Association. It's their union. And I spent a lot of time inside California's prisons working with officers and have a tremendous amount of respect for the job they do. It was hard then. I can't imagine what it is like now. Because like I said, you've got people like she talked about, Richard Allen Davis, or people that think they know that they probably will not get out. Let's talk about Ing, let's say. What's to prevent him from attacking or killing a guard now? He's got nothing to lose. You know, at least before there was a little bit of fear that if you harmed an officer, a correctional officer, or killed a correctional officer, you're going to get prosecuted. And maybe if you weren't on death row, you're going to end up on death row. We've taken that all away. And so I can't believe the governor's saying he's doing this to make it better for the workers. And it's not just the correctional officers. Let's not forget we have civilian workers. We have teachers and nurses and people like that within our prison system that are civilians. I mean, think about the female employees that don't carry, you aren't trained in law enforcement, can't access the guns, like the nurses and the teachers. I hate to say this, but they're prime victims for being sexually assaulted now.
Yeah, there was just a female correctional officer who was taken captive and raped for 8 hours. This just happened.
Well, that's what you were saying, Laura. Like, these killers that you talk to, they don't have impulse control.
No. And they've even said, like, when they went to committee or talked to, you know, the head psychiatrist at San Quentin, they said, we're going to put you in a cell with somebody. And they've all said, you know, if you do, I will kill that cellmate. And they are very serious about they will kill this person. And there's now a group of mothers of other inmates, because, you know, now you're mixing in death row inmates with just regular offenders. And a lot of these guys are in there for, you know, lesser charges, less serious crimes, and who are only serving a year, maybe 2. And now they're getting placed in a cell with a serial killer. So mothers of those inmates are coming forward about this issue as well.
And yet there's no media coverage on this.
Yeah, there isn't. It's really strange. I mean, because when we went up there to visit, we were up there with Laura up at San Quentin, and I went in the cage with David Carpenter, and we came out. There was like nothing out. You couldn't find anything. There was like, I found one article talking about how they're turning San Quentin into a rehabilitation center and how they're going to spend $280 million tax dollars to convert it into a rehabilitation center. But they don't tell you what it's going to do.
Nina, what does that mean, rehabilitation center? What do they think they're going to do?
I have no idea. If you read the governor's statement, it was 3 things. For some reason, he thinks it's going to make it better for the people that work in the prison, which Laura just explained. I mean, God bless that poor female correctional officer. It's not going to make it better for them. And then it was to normalize it so their life is more like on the outside. And again, when did we lose accountability, you know, for the crimes you commit? You have freedoms that you're given when you're born and as you're raised to this day. We also have consequences for when you break the law. And we have just this theory of the governor takes that all away. I don't know why Richard Allen Davis should share the same type of lifestyle you and I share. We didn't kidnap a 12-year-old girl, brutally rape her, and then murder her. And that's what this is basically. There were 4 prongs on his theory here, and that was part of it. And it just is, I think it's unconscionable. I think it's also when you talk about the money that's being spent, you know, there's a lot of hardworking families in California that probably could benefit from some of that money, maybe being for better schools, since we have horrible schools in California, things like that, you know. Yeah. It's horrible.
I mean, what's the plan? What's the plan? Let's just say this all happens and Richard Allen Davis is able to squeak out of prison. I mean, what's the plan? How do you mainstream him back into society? Someone like that, you know, all these SVPs, sexual violent predators. And then what's the system of keeping track of him on the outside? Have they even addressed that at all?
No, and that's a joke because you bring up a good point with the SVPs. I've been involved, Foster County is litigating a huge SVP case right now. And one, they can't find a place to put them. Then they were going to put this person as transient, which you really can't then track them if they're transient. And, they say, oh, we're going to put a GPS on them. Well, GPS isn't real time unless somebody's sitting there monitoring it 24/7, which is not going to happen. And I'm sure as Laura would agree, a predator is a predator. GPS or not, they're going to do what they're going to do. I mean, the GPS is not going to stop them from snatching someone, raping them, and murdering them. It's just going to show you where their location is. So there is nothing to, and it's really sad because it is going to affect our communities. I mean, it's like you just said, Cindy, you can't even go to the store by yourself in LA. I mean, there are parents who have to let their kids walk to school because they're hardworking parents, but I'm sure they're scared every day now too. It's just crazy. And then you get these rogue, I'm a district attorney, but you get these other rogue district attorneys that also are forgetting about the victims. So the case I was telling you about the Carol Ann's murder, we now have the DA there, Jeff Rosen, who wrote a letter to the victims. Okay, he did forget the surviving victim, by the way, of the Carol Ann's murder, but he wrote a letter to the victims, and this just made the news, that he was not going to fight any of the resentencing of these inmates on death row because he believes that only God should decide when they die. Well, again, now we have a DA that was sworn to uphold the laws. He should be fighting on behalf of the victims of public safety, but because of a personal belief is going to let these 7 murderers be resentenced.
But that seems to be what's happening in our society. I mean, I was a journalist for a while, and you're supposed to be objective. I'm not supposed to bring my own personal beliefs into what I'm writing about, much less being a officer of the court and bringing in your own political thoughts. I mean, that's not really what the system is supposed to be, correct?
Absolutely not. Nor should an elected governor be able, with a stroke of the pen, to interject his own personal belief. Whether you support the death penalty or not, everybody is entitled to their personal beliefs. But if we don't support what our jury system does, what our voters want, we have then pretty much gone from a democracy to a tyranny. I mean, we have a democratic process for a reason. Look, I don't always agree with who's elected. I don't agree with when we elected Governor Newsom. I'm not a fan, not a pro. But the voters voted him in. But that person should not have a right to change the other things that the voters have voted in. And so
let's just clarify that for our audience. So before Newsom was elected, the voters had voted in to have the death penalty.
They tried to abolish the death penalty in California 2 times. Overwhelmingly, California voters, and it went to a vote, voted to keep it. Then in 2016, an initiative was run, Proposition 66, which streamlined it, which means it cut down on a lot of the court process. It still protected the rights of the accused and the condemned. They got their appeals, everything, but it streamlined it much more like a lot of other states in the United States. That was voted overwhelmingly by the voters of California. And then we elect a governor who just decides that he's not going to uphold what the voters want.
Okay, see, that's frightening, because isn't the whole point of our society that if we vote for something, that they're supposed to uphold what the voters want, not just go in and decide to do whatever they want. Like you said, then it becomes a tyranny. It's not a democratic society anymore.
Right. And it's crazy. And then you get things in the legislature. I was talking a little bit earlier about SB 94, which was authored by Senator Cortese, and Crime Victims United successfully fought it. But what that was going to do was allow these people that were serving life without the possibility of parole, again, some of the worst, to be resentenced, to have resentencing hearings after serving only 25 years. And then you look at SB 483, which was authored by Senator Ben Allen, and this is the one that Richard Allen Dix is using, because it's saying that he gets to be resentenced, and it should invalidate the enhancements for torturing and kidnapping and raping a 12-year-old girl that put him on death row. So our legislature is also out of touch with our communities in California. And that's why it's so important for victims, for people, for public safety to really start paying attention of who we're electing, what they're really saying, or what's going on. There is an initiative coming that actually was written by public safety leaders We just qualified an initiative for the November ballot. It is the Theft, Homelessness, and Drug Reduction Act, I believe is the title of it. And what that does is it does a variety of things, but most of all, it brings back some balance to our criminal justice system, because Proposition 47 was voted in by the voters in the state of California, and it was titled Safe Neighborhoods Act. It was a complete lie to the voters, because what it did is it downgraded those serious crimes like I talked about, domestic violence, child sex slavery. It downgraded certain murder categories. Everything became nonviolent. So a lot of people are not being sentenced like they should be for selling a child into slavery or raping an unconscious woman. It also caused our theft explosion that we have in California that we see, because now you can steal $950 a day and not get any consequences. And it took away the ability of prosecutors to actually help people and maybe put them in drug court or veterans court or mental health court. So this this initiative is designed to help fix some of that. It'll put back the ability to, have some of these crimes become serious crimes, which I think anybody that doesn't think about the human trafficking of a child is not a serious or violent crime should take a hard look at what they're thinking, because you're looking at young children who are tattooed and branded and I've met them that have knife cuts in their face because the person that's selling them didn't give them enough money. They've watched their friends get murdered. They've been sold. These are a lot of our immigrants too that this is happening to, and yet California says that's not a serious or violent felony. So it fixes that. There's also gives the prosecutors the ability to now start mandating, hopefully if this passes, drug court or getting some people some help with veterans court or mental health court or things like that. And it helps to address our fentanyl crisis that is in California, which is the leading killer of people between 18 and 45 right now.
Yeah,
So these are the things we're having to bring to the voters, because we tried to address the fentanyl crisis in the legislature last year, and they would not pass it. So they actually walked out on these hundreds of families that were testifying about who had lost loved ones to fentanyl poisoning. So, we have the voters to do this. That's just how out of balance everything is from the top down. So now we're releasing Richard Allen Davis, possibly.
Yeah, I just don't think they understand. I don't know what's motivating them, but unless it happens to them, I don't think they're really going to understand it.
Well, Newsom was in Target and he was buying something and they got robbed. The Target was being robbed right in front of him. And he looked at the clerk and he said, well, aren't you going to do anything? And she was like, no, I can't do anything. They're allowed to take it. And he's like, what are you talking about? Get your manager. And she's like, but this is your law. Yeah. And I don't even think does he not know what his laws are? I'm very confused by all of this. This is very disturbing.
It is very disturbing, because what we're doing is tolerating and excusing criminal behavior. We're excusing murderers. We're finding reasons why Richard Allen Davis or other people on death row should get second chances. Where the serial killers Laura's talking about.
It would be one thing if they were able to be rehabilitated, but it is proven, Laura, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if you're a sexual offender on a serial killing, you're not going to be rehabilitated. Look what happened with William Suff. He murdered his child in Texas. He spent 10 years in prison. He came to California and he became a massive serial killer. And there's probably like 50 women that haven't been found yet because of him. Laura, is it possible for any of them to be rehabilitated in your experience?
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate really quick here, because it's funny, because we were just talking about me getting a PhD right before we jumped on this. I've worked on a serial killer study for the last 10 years, and it will not qualify when I go for my PhD. I have to do something new. And my plan was always to go study abroad in Europe within the prison system to come back and implement it into here, which is what Newsom is trying to do. And I believe in that, because they're way ahead of us, in our justice system, our prison system, and everything. However, you need to be doing this in the proper way. Oregon's doing it, but they're doing it very slowly, and they're doing it based on offenders. So when you're taking an offender, like let's say somebody on death row who was an 18-year-old at the time robbing a bank, and he was just driving the getaway car, and someone got shot, but he was just driving the car. He didn't actually pull that trigger. Should his case be relooked at, 30 years later? Possibly. But should Roger Allen Davis come into play? Should he be also under that law being re-examined? No. They're lumping all the criminals together, which is the biggest problem. And Norway doesn't have gangs like we do. California is gang-ridden. We have serial offenders. Norway doesn't even have serial offenders like we do. So we're implementing, something from Europe without, bringing it on the psychologist who can properly do this and, target the needs of each criminal to do this in a safe fashion.
Well, it also sounds like from what Nina was telling us is that they're not bringing the proper people in to kind of give the advice to the politicians on how the studies and stuff like that. It sounds like they're just making these decisions based upon their political values as opposed to the real hard facts and the data that is being produced.
I would absolutely agree with what Laura said. And the other part of it is, like I said, on his committee, he's not even included victims or public safety, who probably have the biggest stake in this. I mean, I don't know I don't even know if correctional officers are included on this. I mean, I don't know how you can think you can transform a prison or re-sentence death row inmates and, look at it without hearing from probably the most important parts of our criminal justice system. This governor and this legislature have completely shut out the victims. They are shutting out public safety, and those people need to be at the table as well when we're looking at these things.
Yeah. Well, as a district, you're currently a district attorney, correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So I'd like to get your feedback on what's it like navigating it from the prosecution side now with all these new restraints that you've been dealing with and trying to prosecute crime.
The majority of my colleagues, leave Los Angeles alone and a few other counties, still have an utter just belief in upholding public safety and doing what's best for their communities. I watch, colleagues from my big cities like Orange County to smaller counties like Yolo County. We believe in being ethical and prosecuting and still prosecute to what we have a duty to prosecute what we believe we can prove and what is ethical. And by and far, all across these counties, they do that. But it is so difficult because we know and we see the aftermath and the toll on the victims. And, there used to be a time when we could tell a victim, hey, this person's going to go away for life. You're going to be fine. And they got told that, like Mark Klass, like the brother of the Carol Ann Lanchimers. They were told, we can't bring back your loved one, but at least we can get you some justice. And now we're having to go back and tell these people, we're sorry, the state of California lied to you, and that is probably the hardest job that prosecutors are facing right now, along with the enormous workload it takes to deal with these resentencing. Because you got to remember too, a lot of these cases were prosecuted 20, 30 years ago. The original prosecutor is not there anymore, more than likely, very rarely. So you're having to get another deputy DA or assistant DA. They're having to review the case, get up to speed, meet with the families, read the trial transcripts. So the enormous toll that it takes on the office is huge to begin with, just on a workload level. And we're having to fight all these resentencings. And I have to say, what Laura brought up, a lot of my colleagues, we all discuss it, and we are trying to do it right. So we may look at a case where maybe it was the getaway driver at 18 years old. Did they deserve life? Maybe have they been good in prison? We look at everything. And those ones, if that criteria is met, we don't necessarily, and we talk with the victims, we don't necessarily fight maybe that resentencing. But on these other ones, we do. And so we're having to put all that together. You're having to explain that to the victims, which is the most heartbreaking and excruciating thing I think anybody can do. So it's a lot. But we're all committed to seeing, safe public safety. And that's our duty. And I know the majority, like I said, of my colleagues are doing that. I mean, there's some of us that even help because unfortunately Los Angeles does not have a prosecutor that stands up for victims, a head DA. I don't think that's any secret when you look at Los Angeles right now. So we help victims in other counties now too. So
I think there's just, the way you explained it, it just sounds like there's a huge lack of common sense. What Laura was saying earlier is that, looking at each case individually, But it's like she said, they're lumping them all together, and they're not using common sense. And I think that's kind of the stem of a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's even things that have passed in the legislature when you're looking at like gang murder cases. And absolutely, as a prosecutor, there should be no racism, no anything like that. It has to be fair and ethical. But now we can't even, oftentimes when there's a gang hit, they play rap music, right? It's part of their culture, or things like that are part of their gang. We're even hampered that we necessarily can't bring that into court anymore. It has gone so far to do everything to alleviate the accountability of some very vicious people. And you keep going back to the why. And I think all of us struggle with either you just live in an ivory tower, like the governor, and it doesn't affect you and your family because guess what? You have bulletproof cars, you have security 24/7, but none of us down here do.
Nope.
None of the people in the poor communities in California have that kind of protection. The women that are being sold into slavery or, being raped, male or female, a lot of them are just people that are just trying to live and work. And maybe, they don't live in the best neighborhood. And those are the ones that are getting hit the hardest. And to me, that's the saddest because they don't have the strongest of voice because they can't.
Yeah. Well, Nina, I'm really thankful that you're at the front lines there fighting the good fight. You've been doing it your entire life, ever since you were a teenager, and really thankful that you're doing that. I'm glad you and Laura have connected because I think you both are amazing women doing amazing work, and we definitely have to keep tabs on what you're doing, and hopefully you can help each other. And because Laura's big thing is about the victims, trying to find answers to the victims' families for all of these other victims that they never got answers for and that are still out there.
And Nina, what could you say to families that are families of victims and what they can do if they have to endure this horrific murders that happen to these families? What is their recourse?
There is a lot, and I will tell you that. But before I do that, first of all, I want to thank you and Cindy and Rob for doing this podcast because this is how we start educating people, start making them aware. I believe this is how we start making a difference. And to Laura and Rob Dick, who are out there trying to help victims of cold cases, I cannot thank you enough. I just actually charged a cold case murder here in Modoc County. And when I called that family, after years of wondering what happened to their daughter, just the tears of relief, knowing that at least there might be some justice was amazing. So I can't thank you guys enough for doing that. And as far as for victims out there, first of all, please know my heart goes completely out to you. But what I would tell you is reach out to the resources. Crime Victims United is always available, to help, to listen, to help guide. But also, it's the same thing. When you don't let the system silence you, you do have rights. You have a right to be heard at every stage of a proceeding. That means from a bail hearing all the way through the sentencing of someone. You have your right, you have your voice, and whether the defense or maybe the DA doesn't want to support it, you get to assert that right and you should be heard. And don't be afraid to go to the media. I mean, I tell that to people all the time. Speak out and then be aware of what's going on out there. You're welcome to, like, Crime Victims United puts out stuff that's going on and bills that they're trying to pass. It just sometimes takes simply a phone call to your representative to maybe change the course of a law that's benefiting criminals and not victims. So it's also just being aware, being involved in the community. But the biggest thing for victims is use your voice, assert your rights. Do not let the system overtake you.
Perfect. I think it's a perfect place to end it. Thank you both, ladies, and the incredible work you do.
Please visit our website where you can subscribe to the podcast, find show notes, and check out extra content from all of our podcasts. All rights reserved. This has been a production of 722 Media Content.